Good morning. First, I would like to acknowledge the Biripi Nation, the original owners of the land from which I am talking to you today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. 200 years ago, Port Macquarie was established as a penal settlement to which people convicted of offences could be sent. At that time, under the British laws that applied in the colony, transportation remained one of the standard punishments for various offences. In 1804, Newcastle had been established as a penal settlement to which prisoners could be transported, but by 1820 it was decided that it was too close to Sydney for escaping convicts. In March 1821, Governor Macquarie formally appointed Captain Francis Allman of the 48th Regiment to be Commandant of a new settlement at Port Macquarie. Allman had visited Port Macquarie with Surveyor General John Oxley the previous November to select the best site for the settlement. To prepare the new settlement to receive convicts sent there as punishment, Macquarie directed the Chief Engineer to select from the Sydney gangs 60 volunteers who would be sent to Port Macquarie for 18 months to build the initial infrastructure. At the end of the 18 months, in case of good, steady conduct, sobriety and industry, they would receive tickets of leave. Who were these 60 convict volunteers? No list of them has ever been found in the surviving records. Some years ago, as a spare time project, I started to see if I could identify them, but ended up putting it on the back burner. However, as the bicentenary of the establishment of the settlement approached, I decided to make a more determined attempt to identify them. Of course, without a list, we cannot be certain that 60 convicts were actually selected. My research resulted in a book recently published by the Port Macquarie Historical Society. Almost immediately after I had given the printers approval to print, we received a copy of the memoirs of a member of a local family, in which they claimed descent from Charles Wilkins, a convict. It was stated that Charles was obviously considered to be a well-behaved convict, as he was chosen to go to Port Macquarie as a blacksmith with the First Fleet in March 1821. He returned to Sydney after 12 months. Charles Wilkins was not on my list. Had I missed something? I decided I needed to check this out. I found two potential candidates. The first had been transported to New South Wales aboard the Somersetshire in 1814. He had been convicted in 1812 and sentenced to transportation for 7 years. Consequently, his sentence would have expired in 1819. In the 1822 muster, he was recorded as being free by servitude and residing at Windsor. Clearly, he could not have been one of the volunteers. He did, however, come to Port Macquarie in October 1822, after being convicted by the Court of Criminal Jurisdiction on the 9th of October and given a 7-year sentence, and he was subsequently recorded as being at Port Macquarie in the 1823-25 muster and in the 1828 census. The second potential candidate had been convicted in 1814 and sentenced to transportation for life. He was a blacksmith and arrived in the Bearing in 1815. He had been given a ticket of leave, number 1237, in 1817, having been married in 1816. However, his son Henry was baptised in Sydney on the 12th of August 1821, and his daughter Elizabeth was baptised in Sydney on the 10th of November 1822, her birth being recorded as 12 October 1822. These events make it highly unlikely that he could have been at Port Macquarie in 1821 and 22. The family story appears to be one of those myths. While researching the convicts at Port Macquarie at the time the convict establishment was ended in 1847, I was trying to determine which convict named John Hughes per Daphne in 1819 was in Port Macquarie in 1846. There were 2 convicts named John Hughes aboard the Daphne. In the end, I was unable to determine which of the convicts, named John Hughes, was an invalid prisoner with a crippled arm at Port Macquarie in 1846. Indeed, it might have been neither, as he was supposedly aged 35 in 1846. Although I have to admit I don't think Colonial Surgeon Gamack was very good at estimating the ages of his patients. There were 4 convicts named John Hughes who had arrived by other ships between 1829 and 1838 who would have been closer in age to 35. However, while looking at the various documents, I came across a ticket of leave issued to John Hughes in 1830. This was a replacement ticket, replacing one issued on the 14th of October 1822, 8 years earlier. It stated that the original had been granted in consideration of his having volunteered his services to the settlement of Port Macquarie at its first establishment. This was conclusive evidence that this John Hughes had been one of the volunteer convicts. Unfortunately, the registers of tickets of leave issued prior to the 29th of July 1824 have not survived, so it is only if a convict was issued a replacement ticket of leave that a record will be found in the ticket of leave records. Tickets of leave were replaced frequently because they simply wore out. However, a convict whose sentence had expired would have had no need for a replacement ticket of leave. This would mean that any convict volunteer with a sentence of 7 years would be unlikely to have had a ticket of leave needing replacement. By scrolling the microfilm of the registers of tickets of leave from 1824 to 1827, I was able to identify a number of volunteers who had had replacement tickets issued to them. From this searching, I found 13 of the volunteers. The ticket of leave records identify them as volunteers beyond reasonable doubt. And this is the list of the ones that I have found. A significant source of information ought to be the Commandant's letters. Unfortunately, however, they don't supply any lists of convicts, and the only convicts that the Commandant bothers to mention are those that died, drowned, were speared, or ran away. Indeed, a runaway is the first one mentioned. On the 24th of May, only 5 weeks after arriving at Port Macquarie, Francis Allman reported to the Colonial Secretary that one of the convicts, named John Baker, had deserted and had not been heard of since. Unfortunately, he does not identify John Baker by ship of arrival. In fact, Allman rarely identifies convicts by their ship of arrival. About 8 convicts named John Baker would appear to be candidates for selection as volunteers, likely to be strong and healthy, most likely to have arrived in the colony in the last few years, and thus have an incentive to qualify for a ticket of leave. The one who arrived on Atlas in 1819 apparently died shortly after his arrival. The man who arrived on the Dromedary was recorded as an overseer in 1822, unlikely for someone who had run away. The John Baker who arrived on the Hadlow in 1818 was issued a ticket of leave in 1823. This would seem unlikely for someone who had run away. The man who arrived on the Indefatigable was sent to Newcastle in 1819 and was still there in 1822. There appears to be no subsequent record of the man who arrived on the John Barry in 1819. The man who arrived on the Neptune was sent to Newcastle in 1819 and given permission to marry at Parramatta in 1823, so he doesn't seem particularly likely. The convict who arrived on the Ocean in 1816 was sent to Tasmania in 1817 and died there. The man who arrived on the Recovery in 1819 was employed by Mr. Greenway in 1822. This again would seem to be unlikely if he had run away. This leaves by default the man who arrived on the John Barry. As there is no further record of him, it seems likely that he died in the bush after having deserted. While we can't say he was the man named by Allman beyond reasonable doubt, he appears to be so on the balance of probabilities. On the 3rd of August 1821, Allman wrote to the Colonial Secretary, "On the 22nd ultimo, that is July, we lost one man named James McMahon, a prisoner of the Crown after a protracted illness." As the illness was protracted, it seems highly unlikely that the man had been sent to Port Macquarie for punishment. We don't actually know when the first prisoners were sent to Port Macquarie for punishment, so it seems unlikely that James McMahon was a volunteer. An earlier publication of the Port Macquarie Historical Society, The Winding Sheet, had identified James McMahon as arriving on the Surrey in 1816. However, that James McMahon was recorded as being transported to Port Macquarie in February 1825, so it clearly wasn't him. The only other James McMahon to arrive in New South Wales before 1822 was the one who came on the Guildford in 1816, and as he does not appear in any other records after 1820, this is his listing in the 1820 return of convicts in the colony, it seems conclusive that this is the man who died at Port Macquarie. On the 5th of November, Allman wrote to the Colonial Secretary, "The natives of this place have become very hostile, by which I am sorry to say 2 prisoners of the Crown, named John Simpson and William Penny, were speared on the 24th of October last. The former died of the wound so received on the 29th. The latter is fast recovering." The register of convicts sent to Port Macquarie as punishment, kept in the Colonial Secretary's office, clearly records that John Simpson had been convicted at Sydney in 1820 and given a sentence of 7 years. Additionally, it records that he died in the last quarter of 1821. So clearly John Simpson was not one of the volunteers. William Penny appears on the 1821 Return of Convicts in New South Wales, where he is recorded as being at Port Macquarie, but he does not appear in the 1822 muster. He is not listed in the register kept in the Colonial Secretary's office of convicts sent to Port Macquarie for punishment. He is not recorded as having received a ticket of leave. So it would seem likely that after his recovery, he was simply allowed to return to Sydney. In the absence of any other information, I assume that on the balance of probabilities, he was one of the volunteers. On the 15th of December, Allman wrote to the Colonial Secretary, "It is with much concern that I have to report the loss of 2 men when waves upset on the bar one of our whale boats, which in rowing out to assist in towing the vessel in on the day she first appeared. The unfortunate men were John McCabe, tutor to my children, and who had received his free pardon from the Governor only a few days previous, and the other man, one of our volunteers, named Benjamin Warhurst." While Allman does not identify John McCabe as one of the volunteers, McCabe named himself as such in his petition to Governor Macquarie, a petition which he made while the Governor was visiting Port Macquarie the previous month. Stating on the formation of the settlement of Port Macquarie, he was one of the number who volunteered their services to form the new settlement. Consequently, both of these men can be added to the list of volunteers, with conviction. In the same letter, Allman advised of the death of another convict, whom he names as James Mason. "I have to report the death of a prisoner of the Crown, James Mason. He was killed on the 17th of November by a tree falling on him." Again, Allman does not record the ship Mason arrived on, which raises the question, which James Mason is he? The Winding Sheet, which purports to record all the deaths and burials in Port Macquarie's first colonial burying grounds, determined that James Mason was one of 2 convicts with that name. either the one who arrived on the Lady Castlereagh in 1818 or the other who arrived on the Dromedary in 1820. These were the only convicts named James Mason to arrive in the colonies by this time. However, according to Tasmanian Archives records, both of these men were alive in Tasmania well after the date the man was killed by a falling tree. It would appear, therefore, that Allman was mistaken in naming the man killed as James Mason. Excluding these two men, there were 39 convicts who arrived prior to 1822 with the last name Mason, including as an alias. Excluding those who arrived before 1810, as they were unlikely, or I consider they were unlikely to have been considered strong and healthy if still in the convict gangs in Sydney, this reduces the number to 25. It may be noted that no convict with the last name Mason was sent to Port Macquarie for punishment before 1823, according to the register kept in the Colonial Secretary's office. 12 of these were recorded in the 1822 muster in New South Wales, which would rule them out as having been killed by a falling tree at Port Macquarie in November 1821. 3 more were recorded in the 1823 to 25 muster in New South Wales, while another 9 were recorded as being alive in Tasmania after 1822. This leaves just one possible candidate with the name or alias Mason. And this is Edward Mason, who came on the Fortune in 1813. He petitioned the governor in 1817 for a ticket of leave, reciting that he had been a servant to Mary Reeby for 3 years. The petition is endorsed to indicate that a ticket of leave was approved, but the number is not recorded. He appears in the 1814 muster as assigned to Mrs. Reeby, and this information is repeated in the annual return sent to London between 1816 and 1821. However, for the last 4 returns, the information would appear to be incorrect, as Edward Mason's name was included on a list of convicts to be sent to Newcastle in February 1818. This list indicates that he was sent there on the order of the governor for a term of 2 years. If he had returned to headquarters, to the Sydney gangs, after 2 years, he would have been available for selection as a volunteer on the establishment of the Port Macquarie settlement. No records have been found of him after the list recording his sentence to Newcastle. So on the balance of probabilities, it seems quite likely that he was the convict referred to as James Mason, killed by the falling of a tree. So I think we can reasonably confidently add a further 6 names to the 13 identified in the ticket of leave records. Indeed, perhaps we can even do so with conviction. I mentioned that William Penny had been recorded in the 1821 return as being at Port Macquarie. What is the 1821 return? Unfortunately, its title page has not survived. A similar previous return, that for the year 1820, is described as a nominal alphabetical return of male convicts and those that have been such but now free, who were in New South Wales in the year 1810, together with all those that have arrived since that period up to 1820. There are similar returns for 1816, 1817, 1818 and 1819. If you are interested, by the way, you can download those returns complete and free of charge from the National Archives of the UK. Some of these returns, including that for 1821, are signed by the Governor. They appear to have been compiled by copying the previous year's return, but changing any information that had been updated or had come to the notice of the clerk compiling the list. They are not very reliable, as indicated by the entries for Edward Mason that I showed earlier. But in the absence of other information, maybe they are something to go on. However, the 1821 return is the first that could record convicts as being at Port Macquarie, and in fact it does record 13 as being there. One of these we already know about, William Penny. Assuming the return is correct in recording the others at Port Macquarie, how can we be sure that they weren't sent there as punishment? The answer lies in the register of convicts sent to Port Macquarie as punishment that was kept in the Colonial Secretary's office. On the 10th of October 1821, the Colonial Secretary wrote to Francis Allman advising that 2 convicts, John Reed and John Brown, were being sent to Port Macquarie, and requesting that he provided a list of all convicts forwarded to Port Macquarie thus far, so that a register of such could be compiled in his office. The resulting register, of which this is the first page, starts with those 2 convicts. The following convicts are most likely those sent earlier and now entered retrospectively. Unfortunately, although the dates of colonial conviction are recorded, and some as far back as 1817, the dates they were sent to Port Macquarie are not recorded until later, the earliest being February 1822. Nevertheless, it can reliably be assumed that if a convict's name appears in this register with a colonial sentence date prior to October 1822, which is when the convict volunteer started to return to headquarters, then that convict had been sent to Port Macquarie as punishment. This enables us to rule out James Fisher. His being recorded at Port Macquarie is probably a clerical error, as he was recorded in January 1822 as being part of the Parramatta Town Gang and being sentenced to Port Macquarie. The others, however, remain as possibilities. According to their entries in the convict indents, some were issued with tickets of leave. When we insert into this list some of the known tickets of leave issued to volunteers, a pattern emerges, and it seems we can confirm these as being volunteers. Obviously, the ticket of leave records would have been instrumental in identifying the volunteers if those records had survived. However, we can take some consolation in the practice of annotating the convict indents with the ticket of leave numbers when they were issued, although this was not always done. In this example, we can see ticket number 123 recorded against John Hughes' entry in the indents. The information in the indents has been transcribed in the Biographical Database of Australia. Unfortunately, the database can be searched only by name, ship, or a few other attributes. It is not currently possible to search the BDA by ticket number or have it display a list of ticket numbers. However, the potential may be there for the data held in the BDA to be used to reconstruct the missing ticket of leave registers, or at least a substantial portion of them. On the 28th of September 1822, the Commandant of Port Macquarie wrote to the Colonial Secretary, "I beg to inform you that 21 of the volunteers who came with me to form the settlement returned to Sydney on His Majesty's brig Lady Nelson. I enclose a copy of His Excellency Major General Macquarie's letter bearing date 14 March 1821, which specifies the terms on which they came, and I think it but just to state that they have generally merited the indulgence held out to them." Given that there had been a change of governor since the settlement had been established, and that Governor Brisbane was not as generous with indulgences, Alban probably thought it advisable to remind the authorities in Sydney of the indulgences originally offered to the volunteers. The tickets of leave issued on 14 October would have been issued to these volunteers. Similarly, on 21 October he wrote, "I have the honour to acquaint you that 19 volunteers embarked this day on the Lady Nelson for the purpose of being returned to headquarters, and have to add that I do not consider any of them to have conducted themselves improperly here." This lot would have arrived in time to be issued tickets of leave on the 30th of October, the other date we have noted in some of the ticket of leave records. The 1822 muster was taken in the first half of September 1822, before the first batch of volunteers returned to Sydney. It records about 300 convicts being at Port Macquarie. However, we know the surviving copy of the muster contains mistakes, and it is probable that in collecting, collating and transcribing the information, the board clerks not only made mistakes concerning names and ships, but also places, status, etc. A couple of examples. One convict is recorded as William Tandy per Daphne, and it's shown as being at Port Macquarie. There is no convict of this name. It is likely to be John Landy. The name John Landy does not appear in the 1822 muster. However, he is recorded as being victualled at the lumber yard in Sydney in September 1821, so he can't have been one of the original volunteers. There is no record of him being sent to Port Macquarie as punishment, so this entry in the muster appears to be wrong on at least a couple of points. A second example would be the convict listed as John Boyd per Martha, whose name would actually appear to be James Boyd. Although he received a ticket of leave number 480 in March 1823, this was issued in response to a certificate as to his character and employment since his arrival in the colony, this certificate being given at the Penrith Courthouse in February 1823. This would have required those giving the certificate to have been familiar with him for the past couple of years. This would indicate that he could not have been at Port Macquarie at the time of the muster. The next step is to review the records relating to the convicts who were recorded as being at Port Macquarie in the 1822 muster, apart from those that have already been identified as volunteers, and to check them against the register of convicts sent to Port Macquarie as punishment. If they appear in that register with a colonial conviction date earlier than the time of the muster, they can be ruled out as volunteers. The result is a list of 29 convicts who were likely to have been volunteers. Another type of document that might rule a convict out as a volunteer, and at the same time cast doubt on whether the muster is accurate in recording him as being at Port Macquarie, is a petition or memorial to the governor seeking an indulgence. At the same time, the existence of such a petition or memorial does not automatically mean the convict was not a volunteer. The petition or memorial must be examined to determine what it reveals. A good example is that submitted by William Judd. On the 7th of October 1822, only days after arriving back in Sydney with the first contingent of volunteers to return, he wrote a letter to the chief engineer, who would have been in charge of the gangs working in Sydney. In this letter, he recited that for the past 18 months he had been employed as clerk to Captain Allman at Port Macquarie, and that he flattered himself to have merited the indulgence promised by Macquarie to those prisoners who volunteered their services at the first formation of that settlement. He was actually seeking appointment to a clerical position until such time as the governor should make his pleasure known as to the disposal or indulgence to be granted to the volunteers who had lately returned from Port Macquarie. Very probably, this letter got the wheels of bureaucracy moving, as a week later a number of tickets of leave were issued to volunteers. This is a partial list of tickets of leave apparently issued to volunteers, 37 in total. These convicts were either identified with conviction beyond reasonable doubt through the correspondence or endorsements on tickets of leave, or identified on the balance of probabilities by being recorded at Port Macquarie in 1821 or 1822 and not recorded as having been sent there as punishment. If we highlight those that were identified beyond reasonable doubt, we can see that the other tickets were issued in the same sequence of ticket numbers and probably on the same date. This provides additional circumstantial evidence for there having been volunteers at Port Macquarie. In the sequence of ticket numbers between numbers 119 issued to William Judd and number 157 issued to John Hudson, there are two numbers missing, numbers 139 and 140. It is possible that tickets with these numbers were issued to convict volunteers returning from Port Macquarie, but although I have searched all the indents for all the ships arriving in Sydney between 1814 and 1821, I have not found any reference to tickets of leave with these numbers. The correspondence refers only to a total of 40 convict volunteers returning from Port Macquarie, 21 at the end of September and 19 in the last week of October. We don't know when the others returned. Perhaps some of them were enjoying their stay. Between January and November 1823, a further 8 tickets of leave appear to have been issued to returning convict volunteers. Those that are highlighted are clearly identified as volunteers from the ticket of leave records. The others seem likely to have been volunteers from the circumstantial evidence. As you can see, I believe I identified a total of 49 convicts beyond reasonable doubt, and a further 9 on the balance of probabilities. Although this is only 58 of the total of 60, we don't know whether 60 were in fact selected, as I said before. Sometimes circumstantial evidence is enough for conviction. Thank you for listening to me, and keep looking. You never know what you may find. Enjoy the rest of the conference.